Question is, you must have ideas, even if you get under pressure, and that's the difficulty.
Good evening,
which is your favourite
it's
Adorno
my pleasure
aphorism?
to welcome you this evening. For those of you who don't know me, who are from outside UCL, I am Professor Plaut, and I'm the President and Provost of UCL. I have that great honour. So welcome to all of you, from whether you're from UCL or whether you're from other universities or members of the public. The whole event is open to the public as well this evening. And we are live online, let me just tell you that. So I literally know that we've got people watching from Uganda, Sierra Leone, Zurich, amongst other places. So that's absolutely wonderful. I'm allowed 30 seconds of punching UCL forward. So you are in one of the world's leading universities, and we have a very ambitious strategy, which I think has helped to foster the sort of event that we've got here this evening. So as part of our strategy, we have put into our arts and humanities and social sciences, set up a new Institute of Advanced Studies, which is headed up by Thiaw, and within that context, we have started this UCL African Studies Research Centre. And this centre involves colleagues from literally all over UCL. I think around about 60 colleagues are actively involved in studies to do with Africa. And so instead of putting them all in one place, we've left them in their home, but created this centre as a place where people can come together. And this supports our international strategy because it helps us to collaborate, of course, with African colleagues. And I think our idea is very much involving colleagues from African universities and other walks of life in Africa in the co-production of knowledge about Africa and its diaspora. And it's part of our claim, if you like, to use the strapline at UCL London's Global University. The members of staff who are here who have helped to create that centre are Professor Megan Vaughan, Dr. Helena Nouveau-Kringelbach and Dr. Matthew Davies. And they, amongst other things, run a Masters in African Studies that's currently in its first year. I'm told it's recruiting very well, so congratulations to all of you for getting that off the ground. And the whole thing is convened by Professor Kevin MacDonald from archaeology. So we're very proud of this entity that we've created, and this is one of its launch events. We've got a very distinguished group of discussants this evening, and I'm not going to introduce them, I'm going to thank them all for giving their time and coming and helping to make what I think will be a spectacular academic event. But the whole thing is going to be chaired by Martin Plaut, a journalist, formerly Africa editor at the BBC World Service, and he now works at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, and he blogs regularly on African topics for The Guardian. He's also published books on Ethiopia, Eritrea, and South Africa. Martin, I believe, grew up in South Africa and has degrees from the University of Cape Town and Warwick. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Martin to get the introductions done and the academic event underway. Martin.
Well, thank you very much. And with the Vice Chancellor of the University of Witwatersrand next to me, I couldn't possibly resist adding that I have a degree from that university as well. But I was there a long time before he was. And in fact, since this is the 40th anniversary of the Soweto uprising, I would say that on that occasion, I took on the Vice Chancellor in the Great Hall in a debate with William Kentridge, whom I'm sure you know, over whether freedom is indivisible or not. And our positions at the university were on the line. They were trying to rusticate us, and we said that we would resign if we lost the debate. So it was quite tough. However, it was a student audience. So anyway, on that note, good evening, and thank you so much for coming on an unpleasant, damp, and typically wet London evening. I thought I would just begin by mentioning a book by a good friend of mine, Keith Somerville, which he's just published on the history of Africa since the end of colonialism. It's a fine book, as you would expect, but that's not why I'm mentioning it. I'm bringing it up because of its title, which I wish to draw your attention to. It is Africa's Long Road Since Independence, The Many Histories of the Continent. And I think that's the point. Africa today does not have a single narrative. What is true in Maseru is not true in Monrovia. Cape Town and Cairo may share a continent, but do they really share anything else in common? Is my home city, Cape Town, more influenced by trends in California than in Algeria? And as you know, the African Union is now meeting in Addis Ababa. But is it really true to say that the hopes and fears of the continent are really at the forefront of its leaders' minds? Is Africa anything more than a geographic entity? And if it is, are we in closer to the creation of the vision of people like Pan-Africanists like Kwame Nkrumah, who of course spent a good many years in this very borough of Camden, and who went to the London School of Economics before he disappeared off to Ghana. The four African speakers are going to grapple with the issues that arise sort of out of the whole of the African narrative. They are Habib, who we just mentioned. There is Ibrahima Thiaw, an archaeologist from the Diop University in Dakar in Senegal, and welcome. I'm so pleased that we managed to get a Francophone speaker on the panel and somebody from West Africa, often missed, I might say, in Britain. We don't have enough West African. Anybody who has missed the wonderful exhibition at the British Library, I would really urge you to go and see it. It is just magnificent. He is a specialist on archaeology and has written The Management of World Cultural Heritage Sites in Africa, which I'm sure we'd love to hear from you for an hour, but sadly we're not going to. Then we have Caroline Wanjiku-Kihato, who is an urbanist with urban landmarks in southern Africa and also associated with the University of Witwatersrand. But I'm pleased to say is a Kenyan, which is nice to know that we've got someone there, who has written... Sorry, a Nairobian, I apologize. A wonderful study called Between City, Migrant Women's Experiences in Johannesburg, which is one of the most pressing issues, but again, not an issue we're going to touch on, I don't think, unless she raises it herself. And then there's Peter Waiswa, who is a doctor and a specialist in maternal and child care at Makerere University in Uganda. A university I remember walking through when it was in ruins in 1986, when Yoweri Museveni walked into town with, to overthrow the Amin and the Obote regime. And he's still there, isn't he?
He's still there.
Yes, yes. Another one of those African dinosaurs. Can't do without them. So those are the four panelists, wonderful people. But now comes the bad news. We're trying to get through 4 separate subjects, which means they only have about 2 minutes on each subject. So how are we going to keep them to 2 minutes? I can't imagine, but we're going to try. So the subjects were raised by yourselves. They came in, and the first and the second one, we're going to try and link them to try and get the issues in. In a sense, the question is, are the issues and the problems confronting Africa the result of internal problems, corruption, greed, and all the rest of it? Or are they externally imposed? Are they the results of colonialism, slavery, or even the Arab North, who of course practiced slavery even longer than the West ever did? And should there be reparations? Let me begin with Caroline, if you wouldn't mind, since you are now also, you told me, doing some fascinating work on the Mau Mau and the experiences in Kenya. So 2 minutes on internal and external problems of the...
You look at...
in what way? Can you just explain in what way it plays an impact on your society?
Well, I mean, it was whole societies that were completely disrupted. People were moving and have lost all what they have invested in. And they had to start all over again. And colonization came, and people were taken in a situation, or were put in a situation where they have lost hope. And I think that all of this is still present in other forms, actually. When you take at some of the big corporations operating still in Africa, the thing is that ordinary African, really don't have much interest coming out of those investments. It goes either to the elite, government, or, largely to external powers. How are we going to develop under such circumstances? And that structure, the global structure of the world as it is now, doesn't help at all Africans. If only 20% of those resources that are being exploited, at the max, it can be probably more than 20% that stays on the continent. Everything else is exported. And I think that in that regard, Africa will have a hard time developing. And both the Atlantic as well as the Trans-Saharan and the colonization have something to do with that. I would agree as well that there are contradictions within African societies that need to be addressed, for sure. But I think the major obstacle for really having Africa move forward is that legacy of the past.
Thank you. Adam, I'm sure you would agree with the analysis, but let me put a question to you. What should we do about it now?
So I think you're absolutely right. I think both Ibrahima and Caroline are right. It's both external and internal. The real trick, however, it seems to me, if you want to get out of it, is how to deal with the issue of accountability. The reason that only 20% of resources remain is because there isn't an accountability of political elites to citizens, and there isn't an accountability of external powers to the local citizens. If actually there was accountability, those elites would get kicked out and those deals would never get cut in the first place. And yes, the past lives with us, but Africa's political and economic elites are as complicit in our collective suffering as our past is. So the question is, how do we get out of this? And it seems to me, here's the fundamental dilemma of development anywhere in the world. How do you give poor people power? Because if you can figure out how to give poor people leverage, the rest of it works out. Because suddenly political elites become responsive to that power, and economic elites become responsive to that power. And so the real question then has to be, if you want to find a solution, whether in Africa or anywhere else, is think through that fundamental conundrum of development. How do you give poor people power? Because they're really powerless, but that's why they're poor. But if you can figure out a way around that, you've now unraveled the logic of development. It's not about policy. Policy is important. It's about policy will become responsive to power. And so that requires a contextual understanding in every particular historical moment, in every particular. There are contexts where you could get power like this. You could get power by simply ensuring that a voting system were to work much more effectively, and you could vote out a particular political party, and in that context, create the potential for leverage to happen.
So would you agree with Dennis Goldberg that the whole leadership of the ANC should be removed?
Well, I'm not sure that the entire leadership of the ANC, but I can imagine some very important layers in that leadership would be useful.
Perhaps number one.
Well, perhaps number one. But I do think that the real trick about it is, in every context you have to ask, how do you create leverage for people who are marginalized? So vis-a-vis the other player in the game, they suddenly have possibilities. In the context of an elections, that might very well be the potential possibility of an opposition party. In other contexts, poor people get powers in multiple ways. They get power via elections through the ability of their vote. They get power through collective mobilization, as you've seen amongst the student movements in Wits University and other places. They get power through sometimes the potential for violence. And obviously in a democratic context, you don't want to encourage the violent mechanism, but there are historical moments where violence has become a leverage, and you've seen that fairly effectively, in particularly in authoritarian context. In non-democratic context, it has become a leverage. So it seems to me that really in every single context, in every single moment, there isn't a classic answer. The answer is, how do you think through giving poor people leverage? Because if you can find that and find a solution to that on a sustainable basis, you unravel the logic of accountability. And when you unravel the logic of accountability, you create the possibilities for development itself.
Well, thank you. That was fascinating. And I might say that, you know, you can walk from this building, and I promise you, within 10 minutes, I could take you to people who are living in poverty, which would shock most people who are, you know, certainly on this panel. You know, there are people living 5, 6, 7 people to one room, 5, 10 minutes from where we're sitting now. That is the reality. So we have, certainly in Britain, we have not come to an answer to how you give poor people power. But Peter, do you have any particular answer? I mean, particularly in a place like Uganda, which has such a history of violence and also lives in such a violent neighborhood. I mean, you know, you're not blessed with your neighbors.
Thank you so much.
Apart from you. Sorry.
Thank you so much. First of all, when I was in school, one of the subjects I didn't like so much was history. So I ended up being a medical doctor, and I don't know so much of these things. But let me say this, that like you started, Africa is so different. And the country I know most is Uganda, where our president, whom you met 30 years ago, is still going. Today, made 30 years in power. And he's standing for another 5 years. Now, so Africa is too big, too different. And coming back to Uganda, we were never a nation. We were a nation created by the British. In fact, Uganda has over 50 languages and therefore tribes. Each of these tribes had their leadership. And then when the colonials came, they actually wanted to find a way, to find the borders of Uganda and to make us one nation, basically forced. Now the British remained for all the years they did, and when they left, I'm not sure whether they ever wanted to leave, because actually they never prepared us to take power. And since I'm in a university, imagine you come to UCL, you have the Vice Chancellor and the teachers, you graduate, and you are not ready to face the world. So whom do you blame in terms of Africa? I think it is both internal, but also external, that the people who forced us to be a nation never left us ready to take up leadership. But how do we go forward? I think the African leaders who came, they promised a lot of things. They come from us, the Obotes, and even Museveni, who 30 years ago said he's going to start something new. Kagame in Rwanda, he promised to change Rwanda and leave power. But they found that the power is so sweet. Yeah. And they don't want to leave power until today. And I'd like to agree with the people who said, what do you do when the majority of the population is poor? Finally, one example. 2 weeks ago, we had a presidential debate. There are 8 candidates, but one candidate didn't turn up. And that candidate is the candidate who has been in power for 30 years. Yeah. So he feared to come to the debate because he would be challenged by his colleagues. But he said he was meeting the electorate. In other words, he considered us who could speak in English, listen to TV and radio, to be less important than the majority of who votes. So in Africa, the leaders like to remain with the poor people because these poor people can continue voting them in power. That is the situation. And that's what you see in our neighborhood. And surprisingly, Kenya also tried for us by having the violence that they had a few years ago. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Let me take some points from the floor. You must promise me, if we give you the mic, you'll be brief. Yes? Have we got a roving mic? Just your roving mic coming now, but please just make your point, whatever it is, or a question to one of the panelists, whichever you prefer.
Thank you. I'll be brief. My name is Thiaw. I'm from South Africa. I've been here for about 4 months. So briefly, one of the things that amazed me by being in Europe for 4 months is the level of material comforts that's here. And so I've been wondering, what is it not that the things that you have, you're actually creating the situation that you have in a lot of the African countries. But if you look at development studies, there's no place where that actually tackles like how this world came about and how this material comforts that we experience here are sustaining and proliferating the situation that we have in the different African countries. So to maybe speak on Caroline's question about, it's not just about colonialism ended or slavery ended, it's a process that started a long time ago and is still continuing now. So you see it in the planning structures of cities, you see it in the language and how people see themselves. So is there any way other than just saying Africa must move on of tackling the issue of development without looking at what's happening in the north?
Okay, thank you. Somebody else? This lady here.
Hi, my name is second year student at King's College London. My question to the panel is, how do you think, or what do you think, is the best way for African governments to formalize the informal job market sector? Only because that large majority of, obviously, like, the African job market is made up mostly of people in the informal sector. So how do you think is the best way for governments to, should we say, formalize the informal sector?
Thank you. Well, let's just take a quick round of answers to those, and then we'll move on to the next subject. So, Adam, would you like to take the one about the informal job market? I mean, it's such a fascinating one.
So I think that there are examples of this, right? And perhaps the most interesting example in recent years is Brazil. One of the interesting success stories of Brazil, although it's in crisis now, is between 2001, 2002, and 2010, Brazil was one of the few countries in the world that brought down inequality levels. And if you want to think through inequality levels, the way you bring down inequality levels is either you hold the guys on the top down, so that the guys on the bottom, when they grow, the inequality level increases, or you make the guys at the bottom grow faster than the guys on the top. And that's what effectively Brazil did. As it didn't hem in at the top, it simply made the guys at the bottom grow faster. And the way it did that is through two mechanisms. One is the Bolsa Familia grant, which is a social support grant. But the second was that what it did is it intervened in the informal sector. And it effectively formalized through grants and mechanisms and support and management structures. It basically formalized the informal sector. It took what were small informal operations that were not in the formal economy, it provided them with support, it provided them with legitimation, it provided them with management experience, and it provided them with resources and support, and formalized them. And one of the great things about formalizing the informal sector is small businesses tend to have the greatest impact on unemployment. And suddenly what had happened is employment shot up. And as employment shot up, what you did is you made the guys at the bottom end grow faster than the guys at the bottom. Now, I don't think we know enough about this. And I think that there's one of the challenges of the Brazilian model is that was possible because it was making a lot of money through the commodity boom. So it could actually make that investment. As soon as the commodity boom ended, that entire model unraveled. But the question that you've got to ask is precisely the question that you pose, is they did, at least for a period of time with the existing resources, formalize the informal sector. And it had a dramatic impact on bringing down inequality levels. And if we can think that through, and we can understand the logic of how that happened, and then we can look at how sourcing the resources for that is, we may be opening up a logic, both not only on the African continent, but I suspect at a policy level across the globe in quite interesting ways.
Caroline, would you like to comment on this as well? Because, I mean, women are such an integral part, particularly of the informal jobs market. I mean, is that something, or do you want to take the northern issue? Which would you, whichever you prefer.
Bring it on. I mean, I think I will tackle the formal, informal question because that is my work. And I think the first problem is the vocabulary that we use to describe an economy that might not be on the books, it's not on the state radar, but it is not necessarily the bad economy. You know, I mean, as planners we've learned, oh, formal good, informal bad. Well, let me tell you something. 80% of urban households in Africa survive because of the informal economy. They do. Now, what happens when we start to think about, oh, let's bring them on into the formal sector, whatever, you know, the sector under the ambit of government or whatever, is that, I mean, unlike Brazil's experience that Adam has just talked about, we were working in Byros in Maputo, where a whole lot of people, majority of that city, do not have title deeds. But they have an intricate and sophisticated system of registering ownership of land and identifying and recording transactions. So you go to the chef de bureau, or who has a book this thick, who knows exactly who lives where and on what piece of land. You go to the Ministry of Lands, they tell you nobody owns that land. Nobody lives there. We're like, wait, what? And in fact, now what we want to do is formalize by providing everybody title. And we were really against that, because once you begin to formalize and provide title on land that nobody owns, according to the land ministry, all those people lose it. So we increase the inequality that we're talking about. And I think we need to think about formal and, you know, how we address the informal sector a bit better and in a bit more nuanced way than we actually do now. And it's not simply about formalizing and providing the same kind. It's about providing support, perhaps. It's about providing people access to infrastructure so that they can survive. It's about providing them perhaps better tenure systems that not necessarily around ownership, but around rights to stay. And it's a loaded question. I could go on forever on this. I'm going to stop there.
Well, it's fascinating, very contrasting views and really interesting. Ibrahima, would you like to come in on the north-south issue? Perhaps not.
Well, I think that one of the biggest problem also have to do with that the north-south issue, because what happened with the growth of the informal sector is a result of the disruption of traditional industry. And when you look at this informal sector, particularly in town, how it's booming, it is really one of the things that really make people live. But when you look at it historically, I think that most of the productive activities were completely somehow lost or partially as a result of the north-south connection. For instance, large imports of all sorts of material culture have had a huge impact in some of the local crafts. And in that regard, most of these local industries that were there in Africa were lost with the north-south connection. And in town, people are trying to reinvent themselves via this so-called informal sector. And I think that one of the most intriguing part of it is that most of them actually, it's mostly largely pretty sellers, for instance, in some of our major towns. I think that this is a serious problem. Instead of engaging in the production, people are redistributing some of the goods that are coming from elsewhere. And I think that yes, it should be formalized, and I'm thinking particularly on my field, for instance, there are potential for cultural industries, for instance, to grow, particularly in areas where there is tourism. I think that if these people were helped, it could be an important source of revenue for them.
Thank you. I must begin to sound like the British Tourist Board, but I do suggest if you have the chance, go to the Victoria and Albert Museum, where they have a wonderful exhibition of Indian fabrics. And what that shows you there was the boom that took off in India when Britain discovered the joys of Indian chintzes. And then you see the pattern book that was developed by British colonial people, which brought the patterns back to Manchester, and they then started making them in Manchester at a quarter of the price, because they were made not by hand, but by mechanization, and they destroyed the entire Indian production system, which results in Gandhi, and Gandhi saying we must all weave our own khadi. So you see the ups and downs of politics and production and fabrics in one exhibition. It's fascinating. You wanted to say something,
Yeah, I wanted to say that I don't, at one level I'm probably going to get in trouble with Caroline on this, but the informal sector is at one level a sign of failure. It's a sign of the failure of the formal economy to provide livelihoods for a large percentage of our population. And so in a sense, it's a survivalist mechanism. It's a survivalist mechanism because people cannot address this. Now the big question we have to figure out is if our agenda is short term, if our agenda is next year and the following year, etc., then we take the view that says, let's try and figure out a way to help these people survive the ravages of our time. But if our agenda is, how the hell do we fix this bloody continent? Well, then we're going to start having to say, how do we ensure that we fix the economic system in a way that everybody has a sense of livelihood? How do we bring down economic inequalities? And then I think we're going to have to ask hard questions. So Caroline gave the example of the chief actually having this book in which every recorded transaction of where people live. Why not use that book to actually formalize those assets in the hands of those people? So I wouldn't say, I'm not saying bring in an unaccountable administrator who suddenly takes the land away. But if you took that recorded transactions and formalized it, you've suddenly created an asset base. And by creating an asset base, in that single act, you've brought down massive economic inequalities because you've created leverages and you've suddenly given poor people assets which they can then utilize for economic this. And that's where I think we need to start thinking through, how do we resolve what are structural challenges? Not simply to make people survive, which I think is important, but how do we create a platform and a bridge for a developmental enterprise that goes forward?
I'll bring you in a second, but I don't want Peter to get left off the right of the platform here. Do you want to come in?
Well, what I would like to say, I don't think the informal sector is a consequence of failure of the formal sector in Africa. Because historically, Africa has been based on the informal sector. And we are just copying and trying to evolve into the formal sector. One of the things that I study a lot in my work is community health workers. Community health workers are an informal sector that has been existent in Africa and maintained the public system for long. And in order to bring them to the fore, some of the lessons we've learned is one, we need to recognize that they exist. Two, that they are quite powerful and productive. Three, I think we need to see how to build their capacity, including this informal sector in terms of businesses. If you come to Uganda, we in the formal sector, actually, currently we can almost not exist without the informal sector. I mean, if you see the amount of money I'm paid, I could not survive if I was not buying the food cheaply from those guys who are in the informal sector. So, but in order to expand revenue collection in Africa, we must bring the informal sector somehow on board, but without making them collapse. So some of the things some people are doing is to encourage them to form associations and to make incentives for them to get into groups and get the benefits of being in two groups, including training, capacity building, sometimes even helping them register formally, and also to be able to access like bank loans and support. So I think we must appreciate the role of the informal sector, find a way to make sure that they grow and continue contributing to revenue of a country.
Yeah, and I just want to say one thing, that the informal sector does not equal poverty. Some of the most innovative, highly productive, extremely wealthy, and I've worked in Kibera, people are those who work in the informal sector. And there's a huge economy there that we have no
Kibera
idea. Oh, I'm sorry, Kibera is one of the largest informal slums, they call themselves a slum, in Africa. And the economy there is booming, and people make significant amount of money, and they are in the informal sector. So if we are going to have this debate, we also have to kind of variegate those that term.
Right, we're going to move on to question number 3, which is now the one posed by Emile Sunjo from Cameroon, and we have it on video. I also have it written down just in case. We're going to see the video, we hope. Well, the video worked. Thank you very much. And we have a small tour of the campus. So, South Africa, great help to the rest of the continent or a sub-imperialist power? I think we're going to wait for the people who have the South Africans, we'll give them the word last. So, or people who live in South Africa. So, Ibrahima, what would you say?
I want to be politically correct. But
I can't imagine why.
But I think that South Africa certainly, I think, could play a more positive role. The thing is, though, is that South Africa is a country that, to my view, a country that is still in transition, and which explains many of its current problems, not internally, but also in its relation to Africa and the global world. And when you look at it closely, a country, for instance, the South Africa's neighbors, Zimbabwe, when they went into some of those major reforms, I think that was probably an extreme position. And I think that South Africa may have learned from that. But South Africa, I think, need to go into some major reform in relation with the other African countries. But also internally, I think that the level of poverty, access to resources and basic education, health, and even agriculture, I think all these are extremely important issues. In relation to the rest of Africa, it's a bit more complicated. And I think that, yes, South Africa should not just sit and watch when there are some atrocities taking in place nearby. it should probably try to use its power and its resources to help out. A role that probably there are European countries sometimes do, but in Africa what is missing is a local major power that can use its resources and its power to try to get to reason some of our leaders. And I think that South Africa seems to me to not even be doing enough of this, because they're still in transition, and if they engage in those kinds of activities, I am afraid that may have to impact its relations with the rest of the continent.
Thank you very much. I would just point out that, I mean, everyone's aware, of course, of the French power in West Africa in particular. I mean, you can't move in West Africa without the French. And, of course, you have the American base in Djibouti, but in the last week it's been confirmed that the Chinese have just also taken out their own little base in Djibouti. So it's not just the West that's getting a toehold in Africa. What do you have to say?
Well, back in 1995, when I was a young medical officer, I made my...
I've switched.
You don't talk about South Africa like that.
Well done. Try again.
Was that your only? So that I don't say what I was going to say. But back in 1995, when I was a young medical officer, I mean, a young medical student, I made my first trip abroad, and I went to South Africa, to the Wits University for a conference of African medical students. And I saw the difference. I really admired the country. Now, growing up and going to South Africa many times, I really get frustrated. First of all, you go to South Africa and you see this social divide between black and white, and then the poverty you see in the street, and of course the violence. South Africa, we expected as Africans that it could do more in Africa. But I think to date, it's a little bit frustrating. For most of us, many of our colleagues went to work in South Africa, so it is a place you go and do a job in Africa. So there are hundreds of young doctors in South Africa. But also, now recently, actually, as black Africans, and in fact they call us Africans, you Africans. For them, they are South Africans. We are not welcome in South Africa. You know the violence which happened last year, and until now, many Ugandans, in fact, I had two colleagues of mine who have lived in South Africa for more than 10 years. They're Ugandan doctors, and they wrote to me 3 days ago. They're trying to find a job in East Africa, trying to come home. So South Africa is actually dominating the lot of Africa, the rest of Africa, and Uganda inclusive, in terms of business. They take a lot of the big contracts, the big malls. They actually export almost everything. Eggs, for instance. Tomatoes, we are importing them from South Africa. I wonder why in a country like Uganda, which is so fertile. In terms of education, in fact, there are very good institutions. I would like to go there. Good enough, the Vice Chancellor is here. But I think there is a divide for people in the SADC, that is the South African Development Corporation community. It is so cheap, the rest of us is so expensive. A major role, but I think there are lots of reforms. Unfortunately, last year, they made some to South Africa for a big conference, because so we sit as Africa so much.
You see it on both sides, from a Nairobi point of view and from a Johannesburg point of view.
That's right.
How do you see South Africa there?
I think it's, for me, it's a sort of bittersweet, love-hate. relationship. I mean, I really cannot underscore the importance of, providing me a good education at the university. I've worked, contributed in that society for now almost half my life. So I'm really, I call myself true. Having been there since, in the mid-90s, early 90s, I feel that there has been a real shift in the latter decades around in the politics of belonging, in the politics of accumulation, but also in sort of local community politics. And I think that there is a strand of, there's a nationalist discourse around South Africa belongs to South Africans that is extremely dangerous, and that has resulted in some of the violence that we have seen around xenophobia, the xenophobic violence, and I work very closely on that score. But I also think that what it does to a society, coming back to how we produce knowledge, how we interact, how we get different ideas from different people, is that if it does close in on itself, hopefully people like Adam will not allow that. But if South Africa is only about South Africans, then where is the learning? Where is the interaction? Where are the ideas? Where is the innovation going to come? How does that society allow itself to grow and to learn about other experiences and to use those experiences and to have an exchange between societies around resolving Africa's problem? And for me, that is the key question from my side.
Just before I get Adam to respond as a good patriotic South African, which I'm sure he is, let me just take a straw poll. Anyone who has a link with Africa or is an African here, all those who think that South Africa is a powerful, positive force for Africa, please show. Put your hand up. Right? And anyone who thinks that South Africa is a sub-imperialist power? Well, I hate to tell you. Well, Adam, what have you got to say? Can you convince them that Thabo Mbeki is doing a great job in Sudan?
So I think it's both, actually. And I think that's where the real thing is. I think what's worth bearing in mind is that since 1994, it's not been unambiguously positive. There has been exploitative relations, but I think, and it's changed over time. I think the pact between Mbeki and Obasanjo had some real benefits. They re-established the institutional architecture on the continent, the African Union, NEPAD. I wasn't a great fan of it, but nevertheless it was established. There were a whole series of other continental structures established. There was lots of peace-building initiatives. Between 1991 and 1997, conflicts on the African continent declined by 2/3, down 66%. I think that's quite a dramatic thing. There was a huge mobilization of capital and investment, $2 billion in 1991. The latest last year was $222 billion. It's a fundamental change in that period. Now, does that mean that was the only positive side? There was some incredibly negative sides. South Africa's investment on the continent, it was the first, between 1995 and at least 2003, it was the largest investor on the continent. After that, China came in quite a dramatic way. But much of that investment was exploitative. I think that they are the example of actually importing tomatoes from Cape Town to Uganda is just silly. It's
South Africa, not from Cape Town.
But it is something that clearly is exploitative, and a more inclusive developmental agenda is something that we need to think through. I think that there are two things where mistakes were made. One was economic investment wasn't as inclusive as it should be. And then second, in certain political contexts, Zimbabwe is the most classic example, South Africa's intervention was not unambiguously positive. It may very well have acted in favor of autocrats against citizens, and that's something that needs to be thought through. Frankly, after 2008, I think we've been in serious trouble. I think that the Zuma administration just lost a plan. There isn't a plan on Africa. It's kind of bungled along, but we don't have a serious agenda. I think the answer to where do we go forward, and this is it, I do think that South Africa's future lies with Africa. If there's anything, if you want economic development in South Africa, you're not going to get it unless Africa develops collectively. And so South Africa its future lies at the heart of Africa. If Africa works, South Africa will do really, really well. If Africa doesn't work, South Africa's in trouble. And I think that's where we need to, and for that to happen, there are two preconditions. One is what Caroline suggested, we're going to have to address the xenophobia. You can't make that happen unless you have an agenda that is more open and not an agenda that is so nationalistically defined. And then the second is, how do you make sure that the benefits are equally shared? How do you create an inclusive development agenda for the continent as opposed to a simple imperial agenda? There's some level of imperialism going to exist. That's what power is about. But the question is, can you get a meeting of the minds between the continent and South Africa? How did Europe benefit in the last 10, 15 years in growth? But Germany might have benefited disproportionately in that context. And so that's the real debate, because can you get a meeting of the minds as we move forward? But I don't think I do think there are examples under the Mbeki regime. I don't think it was all bad. I think there were some serious benefits that happened. The question is, there were also some serious weaknesses.
I would hate to disagree with you, of course, but I would point out that the two-thirds fall in violence in Africa at that period also coincided with the ending of the Cold War.
That's right.
Which is being fought out in Africa, and I think one can't dissociate the two. Anyway, but of course...
But it has come back, right? In the Zuma administration.
Indeed it did, yes. Let's see, are there anyone who would like to make a point? Yes, would you like to make a point on this?
Lamini Zuma is the current chairperson, and I'm not sure exactly when her term ends, but not too far away. How would you assess her leadership of the AU and its current opportunity, and also quite a controversial election when she was elected? And what do you think she's done, and where can the AU and its relationship kind of bringing South Africa into that kind of diplomacy area in Africa? Where can it kind of go from here?
That's a good question. One more intervention rather than perhaps a question. Up there, please. Sorry.
It's a marathon.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Diop and I work for UCL. I just wondered, as Africans on the panel, do you not sometimes want to change the narrative away from the problems of corruption and the problems of poverty, and maybe to celebrate some of the really interesting and good things that are happening in Africa? So, for example, the fact that South Africa hosted an international tournament successfully, the fact that Nigeria has a homegrown industry like Bollywood, which hasn't got government patronage, which employs millions of people, and even things like the benefits of the extended family, where old people are not left to die in homes. Is there some times where you feel you want to change the narrative away from a problem narrative?
That's fascinating points. Who's burning to come in on either of those?
I'm happy to do the Nkosazana.
Okay, you do.
So on the AU, I think, for instance, Nkosazana's election of the AU was South Africa's big mistake. Effectively, what had happened is there was always an implicit agreement between Nigeria and South Africa, and even Senegal, I think, that none of them would ever take the chairpersonship of the AU. That was the deal, that the chairpersonship of the AU would always be in the hands of one of the other states. And effectively, South Africa broke that agreement in, 2011 or 2012, 2010, I think it was. And the reason was effectively because South Africa panicked about France in West Africa. And it actually had to do with Libya. It was precisely the failure of the success of NATO's intervention in Libya, the failure of the African intervention in Libya, and effectively South Africa's analysis was not entirely incorrect, that there was undue influence of France through Francophone Africa on the African Union. And that South Africa overreacted in that context and then said it's going to actually make sure that its player manages the leadership of the African Union. I think that was a bad mistake. I think it could have been much more initiative. It could have contained France in much more innovative ways. But it didn't do that, and it actually did that. And Nkosazana had a good reputation as an administrator, but in the AU, her relationship has really soured. She's got, I think, 6 to 9 months left. The big question is, is she going to throw a hat in the ring? I think she'd be really stupid to do that. For somebody who's supposed to be in Addis Ababa and running the African Union, she's too often in South Africa, canvassing for the presidential elections in 2017. And so I think everybody knows that this is a bad idea. And so I do think we need to rethink what has happened. The real trick is, how do you unravel where we came from? And that's, I think, the real issue that we have to think through. I think we've created massive damage. And that's what I mean by a kind of Zuma administration that bungled it. Whatever you might say about Mbeki, he made some big mistakes on HIV/AIDS and inclusive development and Zimbabwe. The one thing that he was quite good at is the diplomatic acumen, and he would never have made such a basic mistake. And that's something that I think is worth bearing in mind. I have to also say something on the narrative.
No.
Okay.
Sorry. Otherwise we get.
No.
What's up? Caroline, would you like to be positive? It would be nice.
Yes, I think you raise a very important question about how, but that really boils down to the kinds of news that we hear about Africa. It's the dark continent. It's where all the sort of wars and hungry babies live, and all the deaths and all, and we have to ask ourselves, why is that? I mean, Binyavanga Wainaina wrote a very gripping thing. It was published by Granta about how we write about Africa. Sprinkle in some wars, get some Idi Amin like dictator to and the question, and I think the problem is ourselves partly. It's about, how do we publish our own narratives? How do we write and create knowledge around what's going on in our countries and publish about ourselves in ways that we can market to other places? We have not enough stories about ourselves that are, that are inspiring. The Ushahidi platform, which was an internet platform that was crowdsourced, that was used in Haiti to identify families that had been impacted by the drought and whatever, that was produced in Kenya. Mobile money, which Sweden is now going to use. Where was that platform built? It was built in Kenya. How many of Nollywood, great informal success story, by the way, where is that? I mean, we don't hear enough of these things, and it's not because we don't understand them, but it's because of the inequality around how we tell our stories and knowledge production on the continent. And I'm really glad that UCL is trying to change that balance and create some more co-production of knowledge around these kinds of things.
I hate to tell you this, but having worked in the BBC for nearly 30 years, and we often try to get positive stories about Africa, but about other places as well. You couldn't sell them. You can't sell them. It's called, there's an old rule. If it bleeds, it leads. It's the story. Come on, I'm not going to go down that road. But let me well, there's one more question I want to try to get to. We're going to miss the last one, but was sent in by Mamadi, and it is, what about traditional authority, its chiefly structures and its traditional beliefs? Are these a help or a hindrance as the continent moves forward? Do you want to have a go?
I think what I want to say is, as I told you, that in Uganda, and then we got the leadership of the state, and it took away all the power. So these chiefdoms, or the chiefs, no longer have any power, and possibly do not have a major role anymore in society, apart from culture and stuff like that?
Well, very short and to the point. Thank you. Ibrahima?
I'm not sure what is meant by traditional beliefs and all of that. I think that all of that is actually part of African modernity. And we tend to look at all those things as being part of an unchanging Africa. And we should understand that most of these practices, most of these beliefs are a product of African interaction with the global world and its own internal transition and changes. And it cannot be attributed to a remote past. In many cases, these practices are part of our daily lives. It's extremely important. And some of the most highly educated elite do engage into those practices. So this is part of African modernity. And when you look at it closely, it appears that these practices, in many instances, were produced actually in modern times. It could be something that would probably it could emanate from things that probably could be a bit earlier, but it changed onto something else in the present. So these traditional, and these chiefs you're talking about, most of these chiefs were appointed during the colonial period. So I don't know why we tend to look at these as belonging to a remote past. I think it's really African modernity. All these beliefs, these chiefs, and all those practices, that's us in the present. That's how we engage the modern world. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, one only has to look here in Britain at the way in which Christmas was produced in the Victorian period. It is a production. So, Adam, I'm sure you have something to say on this.
So I think that the answer to this is twofold. Firstly, traditional authority is very different in different parts of the continent. We shouldn't assume that chieftaincy and traditional structures are all the same and mean the same thing in different parts. I think that that's first worth bearing in mind. The second, you're absolutely right, that much of traditional authority has changed over periods of time, and they're as much a product of colonial machinations as they were of a distant past. And that's something that is worthwhile. The third principle is that I do not believe in uncontained traditional authority. I always think that there's a charm to some traditional authority. You have a queen that runs around the place and you'll have a celebration every 50 years. And you kind of like it. And you use it as a tourism attraction, and everybody comes to Buckingham Palace and pays a lot of money for that.
And they have babies.
And they have babies and all of that kind of stuff. So if you could find a traditional authority that plays around that and make it a tourism this thing, that's okay. I don't mind that. I do think when it's unconstrained power, it undermines accountability. If it undermines accountability, you've undermined leverage, and if you've undermined leverage of poor people, you've undermined the developmental trajectory. So, if you have chieftaincy as exists in some parts of South Africa, where you are effectively a constrained authority, then that's okay. One of the big problems over the last 6 years under the Zuma administration is the constrained authority is becoming less constrained. And that then creates a real problem, because that then does have major problems of accountability. And the real victims of that are going to be black women in rural areas who are going to be really become victims of that. So constrain the authority, it's okay. If you can get away with having no authority, well and good, like the French did. Knock them off. But if you want to do the British model, that's okay as long as it's constrained.
One shouldn't forget that one of the most important moments in the British parliamentary calendar is the moment when the Queen's representative has the door slammed in his face by the House of Commons when he tries to ask them to come to speak to her. That's the first thing that happens. So talk about constrained authority. It's symbolic. No. None. Not a word. Goodness me. Really?
Yes.
Well, We are now only 2 minutes over time, so I think we've more or less stuck to it. I think you have an announcement. Oh, before we finish, let me just thank the entire panel. I'm sorry, Ibrahima, Adam, Caroline, and Peter. Thank you so much for your contributions. It's really fascinating.
That was fantastic, absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. So I have a series of announcements actually, because alongside this event there has been a photo competition, and the panel has met and judged the photos, and I presume they are depicting African voices. But here at UCL we've got a big tradition of working across disciplines and putting together big interdisciplinary activities. So these have been themed according to our grand challenge approach to disciplinary research. So that allows me to introduce each of them. So the first photograph is really about intercultural interaction. And this is the photograph that has won the competition. And that's by Killian Doherty, and it's called Creo House, Colonial Hill Station. And Killian isn't here tonight, but he's watching online, I believe. So congratulations, Killian. He's currently in Sierra Leone, so we should give him a round of applause. So that was the first one. The second grand challenge is human well-being, and the winner of this is David McEwen, and this is titled Exam. Yeah, it looks like it, doesn't it? UCL exam, pretty dingy conditions, and so this is called Exam, and David is currently, I think, in Makerere in Uganda. So he's also, I believe, watching online, so we should congratulate him as well. The third winner is in the theme of global health, and this individual is here in the room, so I'll ask you to come down and collect an envelope. And this is by Nicholas Eakham, and it's called Managing Ebola in Nigeria. Congratulations. The next theme is sustainable cities, and the winner of this is Julia Stricker, and this is called Bullring. And Julia is currently in Zurich, but is also, I believe, watching online. So I would like you to join me in congratulating Julia. Those of you who are watching online, I presume there are envelopes for you to UCL, or maybe we could even send them to you, but please rest assured you will get your rewards. And then there's an overall winner of the entire competition, and I'm absolutely delighted to say that this has been won by Kate Sherry, and it's called Rock Spotters, and it does, of course, come from Cape Town. And Kate, I think, is a PhD student at UCT, and I think she's also watching online. So, congratulations to you. So, I'm looking to the organisers just to make sure, but we, I think, are now finished. Panel discussants, chairman, and all of you are very welcome to come over to the cloisters, I think it is. South Cloisters. As you walk into the hall, that's to the right and in the far door. And I believe that there are some drinks and some meals and the opportunity to network, talk to each other, and reflect on the event. I would like to congratulate everyone that's organised this, everyone that's participated. This is the sort of thing